In the old days, it was not uncommon for women to die in childbirth. However, single dads did not seem to be a thing back then. Did men immediately get a new spouse or give their motherless children away? In the Irish Anglo branches of my family, they were married fairly quickly. My great-great-grandfather had 5 children by his first wife. She died. He remarried in under a year and had another 6 kids. However, stepkids could be quite a point of contention because there weren't enough resources to go around. My grandfather was kicked out by his stepmother. His mother died. His father got sick, and his stepmother wanted him out so the limited income could go to her kids. I also read a lot of similar stories when I was researching newspapers from the time period. Since wives were often at least partly dependent on men for enough to raise the kids, and men on the wives for childcare, mixed families were both very common and very fraught, and presumably that's part of why the evil stepmother trope is so common. Sometimes they were married. Sometimes grandmother or unmarried sister would move in and help. Sometimes the oldest daughter would fill in. Sometimes the kids would be parceled out. My husband's great-granny died. His granny went to an aunt. Sisters separated to another aunt and a grandmother. My SAL's granny's sister died and she moved into care for household. Ended up married to her BIL. So wife 1 was older sister, wife 2 the younger sister. In the past, when women often died in childbirth, single fatherhood was rare. Men typically remarried quickly to ensure their children had care and to manage household responsibilities. Extended family, like grandparents or aunts, also played a significant role in raising children. This approach was rooted in ensuring the family's survival and maintaining societal stability during times of high maternal mortality. There's a reason for the evil stepmother trope in fairy tales. This happened to my great-grandfather. His mother died in childbirth with a younger sibling at 870. The 2 youngest children, including my great-grandfather, were given to 2 spinster sisters' neighbors, but not related to the family and were raised by them. The children were given a hyphenated name which included their birth name and the name of the sister's family. Remarried typically. My mother's father came home to Scotland from World War I, got married and had a son. Unfortunately, his wife died in childbirth. The baby was sent to live with a younger brother and his wife, who moved to Australia. Grandfather moved to America, met my grandmother and had 2 kids. So my mother had a half-brother she never met. Like others said, remarriage was very common. But so it was abandoning your kids or sending them off. My great-grandfather was adopted as a baby. His mother died when he was 14 and there's paperwork of the father trying to unadopt him and send him back to the orphanage. At the end, his maternal grandma took him in. Other times they send the kids to female relatives. 2 of my ancestors lost their parents and went to live with their grandma and aunt. Apparently they were like stereotypical stepmothers in fairy tales and treated them terribly. And sadly, many other times they sent the kids away to work. My great-grandma was sent at 7 to live with rich people and be their maid. A 7 it breaks my heart. My grandma was one of 8 kids. Her mom died during childbirth of the 9th. He put all 8 kids in a Methodist orphanage. My grandma was only 5 at the time. He very rarely came to visit and remarried 2 years later and had another kid. She lived there until she graduated high school. It wasn't uncommon for an unmarried sister of the deceased woman to marry her husband and take on the role of mother for her sister's children. In North America, it was such a thing as orphans of the living, meaning their parent or parents were alive, but they were ill-equipped, poor, or abusive. It was very common for widowers' men who survived their wives to give their children to an orphanage, because men were not expected to raise children. They were expected to work, so that is what they did. X200b. In the book American Siren, John Moon watches his mama drink gin until one day she drops dead. They carried her out of the one-room shack and his dad drops him at the orphanage a few weeks later. He saw his dad as he continued to live and work and drink in Atlanta. Eventually, the dad drops dead too while John and his sibling are still at the orphanage. This is a true life story of a man alive today and born in the 1950s. John goes on to be the first paramedic in America. I used to work at a youth center in Oakland that had previously been an orphanage. I was sorting through some old cabinets and found these large journal ledgers. They contained handwritten records of children who had been admitted and under what circumstances. There were a lot of children, usually large sibling groups, who were admitted by their father after their mother either died or was hospitalized, institutionalized. If the kids were ever checked out by their dads, it usually happened when 5-12 months once he married a new wife. Doing genealogy, we often come across couples from decades before divorce where the husband married several successive wives, and the wife had likewise married multiple successive husbands. One lady outlived 4 husbands, and her last husband had 3 wives. Yes, a quick remarriage was normal, especially between a widow and a widower, like the Brady Bunch or yours, mine, and ours. What time period and location? Different cultures do different things. 1. Consider the prevalence of stepmothers in fairy tales. 2. I remember reading an introduction to an L.M. Montgomery book that talked about how many, if not most, of the orphans like the one she wrote about did have at least one living parent, but not one who was both willing to care for them. If you recall, Anne of Green Gables was originally meant to be a boy to help on the farm. Anne herself had just come from another home where she was expected to care for a number of smaller children. There were a lot of these exploitative adoption schemes around the turn of the century. Orphanages were also pretty common in the olden days. Sisters, mothers, and remarrying as soon as possible. My uncle's wife and him separated. They were in a country where women couldn't take their children with them, so they never even allowed her to see her children despite her trying to see them. She begged him to take her children. My cousins were raised by my aunt until my uncle remarried. Then his new wife mistreated them horribly. I will never understand taking your children away from their biological mother, who loves them, just to let a stranger raise them. The men didn't even want to raise their own children, so why take them from the mother who wanted to? There were more kids in orphanages, sometimes even when one parent was still around. Source: my grandfather in the early 19s was in an orphanage after his dad died. His mother was still alive. In my family, there are children who were put in an orphanage, children who were adopted by relatives, and children whose dads were married straight away, in one case to the sister of the deceased wife. Also, there wasn't the same care taken of kids. They were working in factories at an age when many parents today think they are too young for chores. I don't think anybody would have blinked an eye at a single dad leaving his 6-year-old alone for the day while he went off to work.